That morning, I checked my bank account. It was completely empty. My son called and said, "Dad, my wedding is tomorrow. I withdrew all the money from your account and sold the house." "Good luck," I said. Absolutely nothing, and made a single phone call. When the wedding day arrived, he learned a very hard lesson. If you are watching this, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Let me tell you exactly how this nightmare started. It was a Friday morning, the kind of quiet, crisp Texas morning that makes you want to sit on the porch with a hot cup of black coffee and watch the sunrise. I am Victor Gallagher. I am 71 years old. I was sitting at my kitchen island tapping the screen of my tablet to pay my monthly utility bills. The house was peaceful. It had been overwhelmingly silent since my beautiful wife Diana passed away. I opened my banking application. My eyes adjusted to the bright screen. The number staring back at me was not the $485 zero zone I had secured just a week prior. The balance read $0. For a man who spent 30 years as a chief compliance officer tracking offshore financial fraud for a major Chicago investment firm, you would think a suddenly emptied bank account would trigger a massive heart attack. You would think I would drop the tablet. You would think I would grasp my chest and gasp for air. But panic is the enemy of a clear mind. I did not gasp. I did not throw the tablet across the room. I just sat there and stared at the empty digital void. That $485,000 was not my retirement fund. It was the life insurance payout from my late wife, Diana. It was the exact amount of money we needed to lay the foundation for a youth shelter in her memory. It was her legacy. And now it was gone, evaporated into thin air. Before I could even process the mechanics of the missing funds, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the front hallway. I set my tablet down on the marble counter. I walked toward the foyer and found my front door wide open. Two men in thick work boots and dirty denim jackets were wrestling my antique mahogany console table out the door. The very same table Diana and I bought on our honeymoon in Charleston 40 years ago. I stepped forward and raised my hand. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was calm, but carrying that undeniable weight of authority I used to reserve for embezzling corporate executives. "What exactly do you think you are doing with my furniture?" The taller of the two men paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "We are just doing our job, buddy," he said. "The new owner wants the place cleared out by noon." New owner. I repeated the words slowly, letting them sink into the quiet air of the hallway. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my house keys. I walked over to the front door and tried to slide the key into the deadbolt. It would not go in. The lock had been changed. They had drilled it out and replaced it while I was sitting in my own kitchen. "I need to see your work order right now," I demanded. The second mover, a younger kid chewing gum, pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his clipboard and handed it to me. I unfolded it. There it was, in black and white, an expedited estate clearance order, and right there at the bottom on the authorization line was a signature I would recognize anywhere in the world. The loopy, hurried handwriting of my 32-year-old son, Derek, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had bailed out of college debt. He had authorized a crew of strangers to strip my home bare. I stood in my own hallway, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood, knowing it might be the last time I smelled it. The movers watched me closely, expecting the typical reaction of an old man losing his mind. They expected tears. They expected shouting. They expected me to call the police and make a huge scene. But like I said, panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you are being robbed. In my career, I have dismantled corporate thieves who hid millions of dollars in shell companies across the globe. I know exactly how criminals operate. I know their arrogance. I know their blind spots. And the absolute first rule of catching a thief is to let them think they have gotten away with it. You let them get comfortable. You let them celebrate. I folded the paper and handed it back to the kid. "All right," I said smoothly. "Just be careful with the legs on that table. The wood is very old and fragile, Nadal." The movers looked at each other, totally confused by my lack of resistance. but they shrugged and carried the table out to the idling truck in the driveway. I walked back into the kitchen. The house was already echoing. It felt hollow and cold. I picked up my tablet again and looked at the zero balance. Derek was getting married tomorrow, an extravagant $200,000 outdoor wedding to a woman named Brooke. Brooke was a woman who looked at me like I was a stain on her designer shoes. Derek had been complaining about money for months. He had maxed out his credit, trying to keep up with Brooke and her expensive, luxurious lifestyle. I had absolutely refused to pay for the wedding because I knew Brooke was just using him for his perceived wealth. I told him he needed to learn financial responsibility and stand on his own 2 feet. Apparently, this was his twisted version of taking initiative. He decided to steal his dead mother's legacy to fund a party. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a cold, calculating clarity wash over me. Every emotion shut down, and the forensic accountant inside me woke up. I walked out the back door and stood in the beautiful garden Diana had planted. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I did not call the police. The police would just see a domestic dispute. They would see a confused old man and a son claiming some kind of misunderstanding. No, this situation required a much more precise weapon. I dialed the number of my lawyer, Martin Rosenberg. "Martin," I said, as soon as he picked up, "execute Plan B." The kid took the bait. Martin did not ask questions. He knew exactly what Plan B meant. He simply said, "Considered it done," and hung up. But a good investigator knows that circumstantial evidence is never enough. I needed a confession. I needed the arrogance of the perpetrator captured in real time. I pressed the record button on my encrypted application and dialed my son's number. The phone rang 3 times. With each ring, I looked at the empty space in my living room where the antique table used to sit. I imagined the empty bank account. I thought about the $485,000. That money had a purpose. When Diana was in her final days lying in the hospice bed, her breathing shallow and her hands incredibly frail, she made me promise her one thing. She did not want a massive stone monument. She did not want her name on a hospital wing. She wanted a sanctuary for children who had no one. She had been an orphan herself, navigating the cold foster care system until she aged out. We had spent the last 2 years of her life planning the Diana Gallagher Youth Shelter. Every penny of that life insurance policy was destined to buy a defunct community center on the east side of town. The closing date was supposed to be next month, and now her own son had stolen her final wish to pay for an open bar and a string quartet. The line clicked open. A blast of heavy thumping bass music immediately assaulted my ear. It was the unmistakable sound of a high-end day party. I could hear the clinking of champagne flutes and the loud, obnoxious laughter of people who had not worked a hard day in their lives. "Hello!" Derek's voice was slightly slurred. He was shouting over the music. He sounded annoyed that the incoming call had interrupted his celebration. "Derek," I said. My voice was completely flat. "There are movers in my house taking my furniture, and my primary bank account has been completely drained. Where are you?" There was a pause on the other end. I heard him say something to someone nearby. "Hold my drink, babe." It was Brooke. I could hear her shrill voice in the background asking who was bothering them. "It is just my dad," Derek muttered to her. The music faded slightly, as if he had stepped into a hallway or a private room. "Dad, listen to me carefully," Derek said. The slurring was gone, replaced by a cold, condescending tone, a tone he had undoubtedly practiced in the mirror. "My wedding is tomorrow. This is the most important weekend of my life. I withdrew the money, and I sold the house." "You sold my house?" I asked. "I made sure to enunciate every word for the recording, and you stole nearly $500,000 of your mother's money." "It is not stealing, Dad." Derek sighed heavily, as if he were explaining basic math to a toddler. "You are old. You are not thinking clearly anymore. After your stroke last year, you have been slipping. We both know it. Brooke and I talked about it. You do not need a massive house all to yourself, and you definitely do not need hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in a checking account doing nothing. We are putting that money to good use. We are building our future." "Your future," I repeated. The audacity of his words hung in the air. "You are stealing the foundation money for your mother's youth shelter to pay for your wedding." "Oh, please, Dad," Derek scoffed. A harsh, cruel sound. "Mom is gone. A shelter is not going to bring her back. You are living in the past. Brooke and I have actual lives to lead. We have a status to maintain. You were just going to throw that money away on some charity case kids anyway. Consider this an early inheritance. I saved you the trouble of managing an estate." I stood in the driveway gripping the phone. The Texas sun was beating down on my shoulders, but I felt absolute ice in my veins. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute that it transcended anger. It became a mathematical equation. He was no longer my son, he was a hostile entity. "Where am I supposed to live, Derek?" I asked, playing the role of the helpless victim perfectly. "That is not my problem anymore, Dad. Put yourself in a nursing home. The proceeds from whatever junk the movers manage to sell should cover your first few months. You will be safer there anyway with professionals watching you. Good luck." The line went dead. A sharp dial tone echoed in my ear. I slowly lowered the phone. "Good luck." Those were his final words to the man who gave him life. To the man who worked 80-hour weeks to put him through college. To the man who loved his mother more than anything in this world. I looked down at the recording application on my screen. The file was securely saved. 1 minute and 42 seconds of pure, unadulterated fraud and elder abuse. I walked back toward the house. The movers had finished loading the living room. They were now heading upstairs toward the master bedroom. They were going to pack up Diana's clothes. They were going to quat her jewelry box. They were going to strip away the last physical traces of my life with her. Any normal person would have stopped them. Any normal father would have called the local police and tried to get his house back immediately. But I knew that if I intervened now, I would only catch Derek on a minor domestic dispute. Brooke would hire a slick lawyer. They would claim a misunderstanding about the estate planning. They would tie me up in civil court for years while they spent Diana's money. I could not let them win easily today. I turned my back on the movers and walked down the driveway toward my car. It was an unassuming dark blue sedan parked quietly under the shade of a large oak tree. I unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and closed myself inside the quiet cabin. The heavy thud of the car door shutting blocked out the sounds of my home being dismantled. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a matte black laptop. Derek always made fun of me for carrying it around. He thought I was just an old man clinging to outdated technology. He frequently bragged about his latest smartphone and his expensive tablets, assuming that because my hair was gray, I barely knew how to send an email. He did not realize that the very banking applications he used on his fancy phone were built on security protocols I helped design back in the late 90s. I was not a tech-illiterate boomer fumbling with passwords. I was the architect of the walls he thought he had just breached. I powered on the machine and bypassed the standard operating system, booting directly into a secure encrypted environment. I connected to a private mobile hotspot and routed my connection through 3 separate virtual private networks. If I was going to hunt down nearly $500,000, I was not going to leave a digital trail for anyone to follow. I opened my banking dashboard. The consumer-facing application on my tablet had shown a simple 0 balance, but I needed the raw data. I bypassed the user interface and accessed the detailed transaction logs. The screen filled with lines of code, routing numbers, and timestamps. My eyes scanned the green text against the black background, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades hunting financial ghosts. There it was, an outgoing wire transfer executed at 8:14 yesterday morning. The exact amount was $485,000. I highlighted the receiving routing number. It was not a local transfer. Derek had not just moved the money into his own checking account down the street. He had used a third-party clearinghouse to bounce the funds before landing them in a newly established high-yield account. I ran the routing number through a financial database I still had access to. The destination was a regional bank headquartered in Dallas, Texas. My primary account, the one holding Diana's life insurance payout, was based out of Delaware. I leaned back in my seat and let out a slow, deep breath. My son was not just a thief. He was remarkably ignorant of federal banking regulations. By moving that amount of stolen money across state lines, he had instantly elevated a domestic dispute into a federal crime. He had committed wire fraud. The FBI would not treat this as a family disagreement over an inheritance. They would treat it as a major felony. I began compiling the digital footprint. I downloaded the wire transfer authorization forms, the timestamp logs, and the IP addresses used to initiate the transaction. With every click of my mouse, I was forging a nail for my son's coffin. I discovered that the transfer had been authorized using a digital signature, that Derek had uploaded a document to the bank to bypass the fraud alert triggers. I pulled up the attachment. It was a scan of a legal document. I squinted at the screen, zooming in on the pixelated image. It was a medical and financial power of attorney. My stomach tightened. I recognized the document immediately, but something was fundamentally wrong with it. Derek had claimed I was losing my mind. He was using a temporary power of attorney I had signed last year when I had a minor stroke, but that document had an expiration date. I had revoked it the moment I was discharged from the hospital. I looked closer at the date on the scanned document. It had been crudely altered. The year had been changed. Derek had forged my legal documents to convince the bank he had the authority to drain my accounts. This was no longer just theft or wire fraud. This was aggravated identity theft and document forgery. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of federal offenses. I saved every single file into an encrypted folder and backed it up to a secure cloud server. I made a secondary copy and sent it directly to Martin's private server. The evidence was now indestructible. Derek thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought he had outmaneuvered a frail old man who would just cry and accept his fate in a cheap nursing home. He had no idea he had just walked into a trap of his own making. I closed the laptop and placed it carefully back into the glove compartment. I looked out the car window. The movers were securing the heavy ramp on the back of their truck. They had taken everything of value. The house I had shared with Diana was now nothing more than an empty wooden shell. But I did not feel the crushing weight of loss anymore. I felt the cold, sharp edge of absolute resolve. I started the engine of my sedan. The quiet hum of the motor filled the cabin. I adjusted my rear-view mirror and took one last look at the property. Derek and Brooke were currently hosting an extravagant rehearsal dinner at a massive rented mansion across town. They were drinking expensive champagne and laughing with their wealthy friends, celebrating a future built entirely on my stolen money. It was time for me to pay my respects to the happy couple. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the long driveway, leaving my empty house behind. I drove away completely silently. The hunt had officially begun, and I was not going to stop until I burned their stolen empire to the ground. I drove my sedan to a parking garage and left it there. I did not want my familiar car parked outside, giving them advanced warning. Instead, I requested a black car through the Uber application. The driver was a quiet man who kept the radio volume low, which I appreciated. I needed silence to focus on the performance I was about to deliver. The ride to the western hills of Austin took 40 minutes. We pulled up to a massive iron gate. The property was a sprawling modern glass and stone mansion that Derek and Brooke rented for the entire weekend. It was the exaggerated luxury that people with no actual wealth loved to show off. The driver rolled down his window and gave my name to the security guard. Since guests were still arriving, the guard simply nodded and waved us through. We drove up a long, winding driveway lined with imported palm trees and expensive sports cars. I thanked the driver, stepped out of the vehicle, and straightened my casual khaki jacket. I was not dressed for a high society evening. I was wearing the clothes I had put on to drink my morning coffee. I was not there to impress anyone. I walked up the wide stone steps toward the massive double doors. They were propped open to let the cool evening breeze flow through the house. The sound of live jazz music drifted out into the night air, accompanied by the low hum of wealthy people trying very hard to sound important. I stepped over the threshold into the grand foyer. The interior was blindingly white. White marble floors, white leather furniture, and massive modern art pieces. Caterers in crisp black uniforms moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of delicate appetizers and tall glasses of expensive champagne. The guests were dressed in tailored suits and designer cocktail gowns. I stood near the entryway, letting the sheer arrogance of the room wash over me. Every single bite of caviar, every drop of that vintage champagne, and every hour this rented mansion cost was paid for by the money they stole from my dead wife. I scanned the room looking for the two people responsible. It did not take long to find her. Eastie Brooke was holding court near a massive indoor waterfall feature. She was wearing a sleek pearl-colored silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. She was laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told, throwing her head back to make sure the photographer hired for the evening captured her perfect angle. Adi. As she lowered her glass, her eyes scanned the room and locked onto me. The fake smile on her face completely vanished. It was as if someone had physically struck her. She blinked twice, unable to comprehend how the pathetic old man they had just evicted was standing in the middle of her perfect rehearsal dinner. Her eyes darted around the room, checking to see if any of her wealthy friends had noticed my presence. As satisfied that no one was paying attention to the wrinkled old man by the door, she abruptly excused herself. She handed her half-empty champagne flute to a passing waiter and marched toward me. Her high heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, sounding like a ticking metronome, counting down to an explosion. I stood my ground and waited. I let my shoulders slump slightly, and I softened my expression. I needed her to see weakness. I needed her to feel superior so she would make mistakes. Brooke did not stop until she was inches from my face. She strategically positioned her body to block me from the view of the main dining hall. Her perfume was incredibly strong and suffocating. "What on earth are you doing here?" she hissed. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was laced with absolute venom. "You were not invited to this dinner, Victor." I looked around the room, pretending to be confused and slightly intimidated. "I just needed to speak with my son," I said, letting my voice tremble just a fraction. I went to the house, and there were men taking my things. Brooke grabbed my arm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug sharply into my wrist. She squeezed hard enough to leave marks. "Keep your voice down, you crazy old fool," she ordered. Her eyes were wide with furious panic. "Look at you. You look like a homeless person who wandered off the street. You are wearing dirty khakis at a formal event. You are completely ruining my aesthetic. Do you have any idea who is in that room right now? There are investors and influencers here. My brand depends on this weekend looking flawless." I gently tried to pull my arm away, but her grip tightened. "I do not care about your brand, Brooke," I said, maintaining the facade of a distressed father. "I care about my home. I care about the money Derek took from my account. I have nowhere to sleep tonight." She let out a very short and cruel laugh. "That is exactly why Derek took over your finances. Victor, you are clearly deteriorating. You cannot even dress yourself appropriately for a social gathering, let alone manage hundreds of thousands of dollars. We are doing you a massive favor right now. You need to turn around, walk out that front door, and call a cab. If you cause a scene and embarrass my husband in front of these important people, I swear I will make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life locked in a state-run mental facility." She leaned in closer so only I could hear her next words. "You have absolutely zero power here, old man. You are completely broke. You are officially homeless, and you are a disgusting stain on this absolutely perfect weekend. Leave right now before I have the private security guards drag you outside and throw you onto the literal street." Before she could summon the guards, a hand firmly grabbed my shoulder. It was Derek. He smelled of expensive cologne and expensive dark scotch. "Brooke is right, Dad," he said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "You should not be here. But since you are, we need to settle this away from my guests. He did not wait for my response. He tightened his grip on my shoulder and practically dragged me down a long hallway, away from the music and the laughter. We entered a private study. It was a heavy room with dark oak-paneled walls and tall, heavy wooden bookshelves that looked like they had never been touched. Derek closed the heavy wooden door behind us, instantly cutting off the sounds of the party. The silence in the room was oppressive. He walked over to a massive mahogany desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. He looked at me, not with the love of a son, but with the cold calculation of a man who was trying to manage a nuisance. I stood near the door, letting my hands shake slightly. I kept my head lowered. "What is this, Derek?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "Why are there men taking your mother's furniture? Why is my bank account empty?" Derek sighed loudly, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if I were giving him a terrible headache. "Dad, we talked about this." He lied smoothly. "Do you really not remember?" My heart hardened, but my physical facade remained that of a confused, vulnerable senior citizen. "Remember what I stammered? I never agreed to sell my home. I never agreed to give you your mother's foundation money." Derek reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper and tossed it onto the desk between us. I had to step in. "Dad," he said. His tone shifted from angry to mock sympathetic. "You are not well. Ever since your stroke last year, your cognitive decline has been obvious to everyone. You forget things. You get confused. Leaving you alone in that big house with access to that much money was simply irresponsible. I could not sit back and watch you become a victim of some scam artist. I am your son. It is my job to protect you." I slowly approached the desk. My hands trembled violently as I reached out to pick up the document. It was a copy of a medical and financial power of attorney. The very same document I had seen on my laptop earlier. But holding the physical paper in my hands, feeling the weight of his absolute betrayal, made the air in the room feel thick and suffocating. I stared at the black ink on the page. He was using my stroke as his ultimate weapon. My mind drifted back to that terrible week last year. I had collapsed in the kitchen. I woke up 2 days later in a sterile hospital room surrounded by beeping machines. The left side of my body was entirely numb. I was terrified. The nurse had asked me if there was family she could call. I gave her Derek's number. She called him 3 times. He never answered. He did not answer because he and Brooke were on a beach in Cabo San Lucas drinking margaritas. I knew this because while I was lying in a hospital bed, wondering if I would ever walk again, the nurses took pity on me and helped me check my social media. I saw his posts. I saw the pictures of them laughing in the sun while I was fighting for my life in the shadows. I recovered completely alone. I pushed through grueling physical therapy completely alone. I regained my strength, my speech, and my mind completely alone. And now he was standing in front of me, dressed in a tuxedo paid for with my money, using the very illness he ignored to declare me incompetent. "It is all completely legal, Dad," Derek said, watching me stare blankly at the paper. "You signed it yourself. The doctors agreed that you needed supervision. I transferred the funds into a secure trust that I currently manage. The house was too much of a liability, so I liquidated it to cover your future care. You do not have to worry about bills or maintenance anymore. I have taken the heavy burden off your aging shoulders. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you," I whispered. My voice was barely audible. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound disgust. Derek misread it entirely. He thought he had broken me. He thought he had finally forced me to accept my new pathetic reality. "Yes, Dad, thanking me," he replied, stepping closer. He patted my shoulder with a condescending rhythm. "Now I need you to go home. Well, not home. Go to a hotel. I will have my assistant book you a room for the weekend. After the wedding, we will look into a nice assisted living facility, somewhere quiet. You will make friends. It will be good for you." I kept my eyes glued to the forged date on the power of attorney. The numbers had been blatantly altered to make the expired temporary document appear permanent. He was incredibly arrogant. He was so convinced of his own superior intelligence that he did not even realize the massive legal trap he had just confirmed by handing me this piece of paper. I slowly folded the document and slipped it into my pocket. Derek smiled, looking incredibly proud of himself. He thought he had just won the ultimate victory. He thought he had successfully erased my entire life without facing a single consequence. I nodded weakly, turned my back on my only son, and walked quietly out of the room, completely ready to destroy his pathetic little empire tomorrow. As my hand reached for the heavy brass doorknob, the thick wooden door suddenly swung open inward. Brooke stood in the threshold, blocking my exit. She had clearly been listening from the hallway, waiting for the perfect moment to make her entrance. She looked past me to Derek, who gave her a subtle nod of victory, indicating that I had been dealt with and neutralized. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face. It was the kind of smile a predator gives a wounded animal when the hunt is finally over. She stepped fully into the study, closing the door slightly behind her to trap me in the small space between them. "You really thought you could come here and make demands?" she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You really thought you had some sort of power left in this family?" She reached inside, searching for something. She pulled out a crisp new $100 bill. She held it up between her index and middle fingers, dangling it in front of my face like a piece of meat. She took a step closer until I could smell the overpowering scent of her expensive perfume again. With a swift, demeaning motion, she shoved the folded bill directly into the front breast pocket of my jacket. She patted the pocket twice as if she were rewarding a stray dog. "Take a taxi to a cheap motel, old man," she whispered, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. "Buy yourself a hot meal and go to sleep, and do not even think about showing your face at the venue tomorrow. You are not needed. Do not ruin my photos tomorrow." I looked down at the green edge of the bill sticking out of my pocket. I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. I let my lower lip tremble. I let my shoulders drop another inch. I reached up and placed my hand over the pocket, holding the money close to my chest as if it were my last lifeline. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice thick with fake emotion. I bowed my head submissively, completely avoiding her gaze. I slipped past her through the doorway, leaving her and Derek alone in their temporary fortress of stolen wealth. I walked back down the long hallway, moving slowly and unsteadily. I passed the grand foyer where the jazz music was still playing and the wealthy guests were still laughing. None of them paid any attention to the old man shuffling out the front door. They were too busy celebrating a marriage built on a foundation of absolute lies. I stepped out into the cool night air and began the long walk down the winding driveway toward the front gate, where I had arranged for another car to pick me up. With every step I took away from the mansion, my posture began to change. The pathetic old man vanished into the darkness, leaving only the cold, calculating forensic investigator in his place. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crisp $100 bill had just shoved into my chest. I stared at Benjamin Franklin's face under the dim glow of a street lamp. She thought this piece of paper was the ultimate insult. She thought she had purchased my dignity for a single $100 bill. But she was entirely wrong. This piece of paper was just a physical manifestation of her unbelievable arrogance. And arrogance is always the fatal flaw in every criminal conspiracy I have ever dismantled. I folded the bill neatly and slid it into my wallet. I would keep it as a souvenir. My fingers brushed against the folded medical and financial power of attorney that Derek had given me. The air was cool, but my mind was burning with absolute clarity. The legal trap was now fully armed and locked. When Derek stood in that study and smugly handed me a forged legal document, he fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. If he had simply stolen cash from a safe in my home, it would have been a terrible betrayal and a local police matter. But he was greedy and he was incredibly sloppy. He used an altered legal document to authorize a massive wire transfer of $485, and he routed those funds from a bank in Delaware to a bank in Texas. The moment those digitized funds crossed the state line, His crime escalated from local theft to federal wire fraud. It is one of the most severe financial crimes in the United States Criminal Code. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not take wire fraud lightly. The penalties are incredibly severe, especially when the victim is a senior citizen and the amount exceeds certain thresholds. He had practically handed me the weapon for his own destruction. Furthermore, the act of altering the date on the power of attorney constituted aggravated identity theft and document forgery. Each of these offenses carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. Brooke and Derek thought they were playing a simple game of family politics. They thought they were just outsmarting a senile father who would eventually surrender. They did not realize they had just triggered a federal investigation that would completely destroy their lives. I reached the bottom of the driveway and stood by the massive iron gates waiting for my ride. The night was quiet. The jazz music from the mansion was just a faint whisper in the wind. I felt a deep sense of absolute peace wash over me. I was focused entirely on the execution of justice. The bait had been taken. The evidence was secured on multiple encrypted servers. All that was left to do was spring the mechanism. I watched the headlights of my approaching car cut through the darkness. Tomorrow they were going to have a beautiful wedding, and I was going to give them a wedding gift they would never forget for the rest of their miserable lives. The black car arrived at the driveway. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. I gave the driver an address in downtown Austin. The ride through the dark city was perfectly quiet. My mind was no longer focused on the mansion or the rehearsal dinner. I was preparing for the clinical execution of justice. We pulled up to a towering glass high-rise. It was 11:30 at night. The lobby was completely deserted, except for a single security guard, reading a book behind a marble counter. He nodded at me as I walked toward the elevators. I pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator hummed quietly as it carried me up. The doors opened to the dark reception area. A single light shone at the far end. It spilled from Martin Rosenberg's office. Martin was not just my lawyer. He was a former federal prosecutor who worked alongside me investigating financial fraud. He knew my methods, he knew my mind, and he knew my late wife, Diana. I pushed the door open. Martin was sitting behind his heavy oak desk. His tie was loosened and his sleeves were rolled up. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated a thick stack of printed documents. These were the digital files I transferred to his server. He looked up over his reading glasses as I entered the room. "You look terrible, Victor," he said. I sat down and let out a long breath. "I feel incredibly clear, Martin," I replied. "Have you reviewed the files?" I asked. Martin nodded slowly. He tapped the stack of papers with his pen. "It is all here. The wire transfer logs, the destination numbers, the altered timestamps, and the forged power of attorney. Derek was stupid to use a clearinghouse. He left a digital trail a mile wide. I spent the last 3 hours drafting the official report for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have also prepared the emergency injunctions to freeze the receiving accounts in Dallas. The moment the banks open on Monday morning, those funds will be locked down tighter than a drum. But the FBI does not wait for banking hours when wire fraud of this magnitude is reported. We can submit this directly to the Cybercrimes Division right now." Martin leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses. He looked at me with a profound sadness. "For 20 years, I have known you, Victor. I have watched you dismantle ruthless corporate criminals without blinking an eye. But this is different. This is Derek. I watched that boy grow up. I attended his high school graduation. I ate dinner at your table with Diana while he played in the backyard." Martin leaned forward and rested his arms on the desk. He folded his hands together. "I need to ask you this as your legal counsel and as your friend. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Once we file this report, there is no retracting it. This is not a civil suit. This is a federal felony. They will arrest him. He will face severe mandatory prison time. Your only son will become a convicted felon. Are you prepared to send your own flesh and blood to federal prison?" The only sound was the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the office. I looked at the pen resting on top of the FBI report. For a brief moment, the image of Derek as a little boy flashed in my mind. A boy with scraped knees and a bright smile. But that boy was gone. He had been replaced by a selfish, arrogant thief who stood in a rented mansion and told his father to go die in a cheap motel. "Blood is a biological accident, Martin," I said softly but firmly. "It is not a free pass to commit atrocities against the people who brought you into this world." I raised him to understand right from wrong. I paid for his education. I gave him every opportunity to become a decent, honorable man. He made his choices. He chose to look at my temporary physical weakness after my stroke as a permanent opportunity for exploitation. He chose to steal the money intended for orphans to fund a ridiculous party. I walked over to the large window and stared outside. True family is built on mutual respect and unconditional love. It is not an entitlement program. Diana and I worked our entire lives to build something meaningful. She wanted to leave a legacy of kindness. Derek tried to pave over her grave with a $200,000 wedding. If I let him walk away with this, I am not protecting him. I am simply validating his cruelty. I am teaching him that there are absolutely no consequences for destroying another human being as long as you share their last name. I will not allow the memory of my wife to be financed into his pathetic illusion of wealth. I turned back to the desk. I picked up the heavy silver pen. I did not let my hand shake. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line on the final page of the FBI report. The ink flowed smoothly across the crisp white paper. I signed my name with the exact same firm, deliberate strokes I had used my entire professional career. I placed the pen back onto the desk and pushed the document toward Martin. "I am completely sure," I said. My voice was steady and absolute. "Spring the trap immediately." Martin looked at the signature. He let out a quiet sigh of resignation. He opened his laptop and scanned the signed page into the secure federal portal. With one click of his mouse, the encrypted file was sent directly to the Cybercrimes Division. The mechanism of justice was now officially in motion. I slept 4 hours on the vintage leather sofa in Martin's office. The morning sun was just beginning to pierce the glass windows. It was Saturday. It was the morning of my son's wedding. Caterers were arranging expensive flowers and velvet chairs on a manicured lawn. Inside the quiet law office, there was no celebration. There was only stale coffee and the hum of computer servers. Martin walked into the room holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee and a fresh stack of manila folders. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He handed me a mug and dropped the folders onto the heavy oak desk with a loud thud. "The Cybercrimes Division acknowledged our file at 3 in the morning, Martin said, taking a sip. "They officially opened a case. The wheels are turning." While waiting, I dug into the secondary part of Derek's financial scheme. I pulled the property records. I stood and walked over to the desk. The coffee burned my throat, but it woke up my senses. "The house," I said softly. "Derek told me he liquidated the house to cover my future care in an assisted living facility. I assumed he had just initiated a standard listing agreement with a crooked real estate agent." Martin shook his head and opened the top folder. "He did not list the house, Victor. He sold it. The transaction was finalized and recorded electronically late yesterday afternoon." I stared at the official county deed transfer document. The numbers printed on it made absolutely no sense. The house Diana and I built had a market valuation of at least $1.2 million. It was located in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the entire state. But the sale price listed on the deed was exactly $600,000, half of its actual value. I traced my finger over the printed numbers. He sold $1 million estate for $600,000. I muttered, my mind quickly processing the mathematics of the crime. He took a 50% loss on the greatest asset in the portfolio. Why would he do that? "Because he did not care about the long-term value," Martin replied, leaning against the edge of the desk. "He cared about liquidity. Look at the terms of the sale. It was an all-cash transaction. No mortgage contingencies, no structural inspections, No standard 30-day escrow period. He surrendered the deed for a duffel bag of digital cash. The reality hit me like a blow. Derek was not just stealing my money for a wedding. The wedding was just a smoke okay screen. The $200,000 party was designed to make him look incredibly successful and deeply rooted in the community. But behind the scenes, he was executing a massive fire sale. He drained the $485,000 from the life insurance policy. He liquidated the real estate for another $600,000 in pure cash. He had gathered over $1 million in untraceable liquid assets in less than 48 hours. He is running, I said, looking up at Martin. He is not planning to stay in Austin. He and Brooke are planning to take the money and flee the country immediately after the reception. They will probably hop on a plane to somewhere with favorable extradition laws under the guise of an extended luxury honeymoon. By the time anyone realizes the money is completely gone and the property is legally tangled, they will be sitting on a beach halfway across the world. Both and Martin nodded in agreement. That is the only logical explanation for taking such a massive loss on the property. He needed the cash instantly. But that brings us to the most confusing part of this entire transaction. Martin flipped to the second page of the file. In all my years of practicing real estate and financial law, I have never seen a property close this fast. The title search alone usually takes a week. To execute a cash transfer and record a deed in under 24 hours requires an incredibly motivated buyer, someone who is willing to bypass all standard legal protections and cut massive corners. I looked down at the buyer information on the deed. The space where a family name or a standard property management firm should have been was occupied by a corporate entity. The new legal owner of my home was listed as Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company. Apex Holdings. I read the name aloud. It sounded exactly like the type of generic shell company criminals use to wash dirty money. Who is behind it? That is the million-dollar question, Martin said, tapping the paper. I ran a preliminary search on the Texas Secretary of State Business Registry. Apex Holdings was incorporated exactly 3 days ago. It has no prior business history. It has no listed physical office address other than a generic post office box in a strip mall. Bade and the registered agent is shielded by a third-party anonymity service. Someone created this company specifically to buy your house. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the bitter taste sharpen my focus. Derek's arrogance had blinded him, but he was not a criminal mastermind. He did not know how to set up shell companies or have connections to underworld buyers who could produce untraceable cash overnight. Someone else was pulling the strings on this real estate deal. Someone with a deep understanding of how to exploit a desperate, greedy young man. I need access to your premium software, Martin, I said, setting my mug down. The public registries are not going to give us the name of the real buyer, but every single limited liability company leaves a digital financial footprint. Madi, they had to wire that $600,000 from somewhere, and I am going to find out exactly who handed my son the match he used to burn down my legacy. Martin stepped aside and let me take his leather chair. I opened a specialized data terminal on his secure computer network. This software was not available to the general public. It was a proprietary forensic database used by federal investigators to trace dark money across international borders. A domestic shell company like Apex Holdings might fool a local tax assessor, but to this system, it was practically transparent. I began running a reverse trace on the corporate registration number. The anonymity service, shielding the owner, was based in Nevada. I bypassed their firewall by cross-referencing the digital payment method used to file the initial incorporation documents. Criminals often remember to hide their names, but they almost always forget to hide the credit card they use to pay the filing fees. Lines of data scrolled rapidly across the bright monitor. I watched as the software peeled back the layers of deception. Within 10 minutes, the system flagged a direct match. The credit card used to establish Apex Holdings belonged to an individual residing right here in Austin. The screen refreshed and a name appeared in bold black text. Chad No massive corporate conglomerate, no sophisticated syndicate of offshore real estate investors, just a single individual named Chad. I typed his full name into a secondary public records database. He had a few minor traffic violations and a dismissed civil suit for unpaid rent, but no major criminal history. What he lacked in criminal sophistication, he made up for in an aggressive social media presence. I opened a standard internet browser and navigated to popular social media platforms. I typed his name into the search bar. His profile was entirely public. The page was a nauseating shrine to superficial vanity. There were hundreds of photographs of a heavily muscled man in his late 20s, posing in gyms, drinking protein shakes, and standing near leased luxury cars. His profile bio listed him as an elite personal fitness coach and a lifestyle entrepreneur. I scrolled through his posts, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. I knew exactly where this was going, but I needed visual confirmation. I clicked on a photo album tagged with a location in downtown Austin. It was a high-end private training facility, and there she was. Brooke, my future daughter-in-law, was featured prominently in dozens of his videos and photographs. In some, she was lifting weights while he spotted her, with his hands lingering entirely too close to her waist. In others, they were taking mirror selfies together, their bodies pressed tightly against one another, smiling brightly for the camera. The captions were full of heart symbols and inside jokes. She called him her daily motivation. He called her his favorite client. But the body language in these images told a completely different story. It was not a professional relationship. It was intimate. It was arrogant. It was deeply sickening. Chad was not just a fitness trainer who decided to pivot into real estate investing overnight. He was Brooke's lover. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a deafening finality. Derek was completely oblivious. He thought he was the mastermind of this grand financial escape. He thought he was liquidating my assets to fund his beautiful future with his perfect wife. But Derek was just a useful idiot. Brooke and Chad orchestrated the entire real estate transaction. Brooke manipulated my son into selling the property at a massive financial loss, knowing that Chad had formed a shell company to purchase it. They were using Derek's own greed to rob him blind. Once the wedding was completely over and Derek was left holding the bag for the federal wire fraud, Brooke and Chad would take all the cash, the house, and disappear. I pushed the chair back and stood up from the desk. My hands were shaking, but not from weakness. It was a physical reaction to the sheer magnitude of the disrespect. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city skyline. I closed my eyes and thought about my house. It was not just a building constructed from wood and stone. When Diana and I bought that plot of land 40 years ago, we could not afford to hire a massive construction crew. I laid the foundation myself. I framed the walls with my own hands, working late into the night under the glow of a halogen work light. I sanded the hardwood floors until my fingers bled. Every single nail in that house was driven with the intention of building a safe sanctuary for my family. We raised our son in those rooms. We celebrated birthdays and holidays in that living room. I held my wife in my arms in that bedroom when she took her last breath. The house was a physical manifestation of a lifetime of hard work and unwavering love. And my son had handed the keys to a sleazy fitness trainer so his cheating fiancé could steal our legacy. The profound insult of it burned in my chest like a physical fire. They had taken something sacred and turned it into a cheap hustle to fund their pathetic superficial lifestyle. Martin watched me from the doorway. He had seen the photographs on the monitor. He knew exactly what this meant. "This changes everything," Victor Martin said quietly. "It is not just your son anymore." I turned away from the window. My voice was dangerously calm. "No, it does not change everything at all, Martin," I replied. "It simply expands the entire blast radius of the situation." Derek betrayed his father for money. Brooke betrayed Derek for the exact same terrible thing. They are all infected with the exact same disease. They actually believe that they are smarter than everyone else, because they have no moral compass. But they forgot one fundamental rule. When you steal a house built by a forensic investigator, you should probably check the floorboards before you try to move in. Martin looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What exactly do you have in that house? Victor, he asked. I walked back over to his heavy desk and reached for my laptop bag. I did not wire the house with explosives, if that is what you're thinking, I said, pulling out my matte black computer. But when you spend 30 years investigating people who lie for a living, you develop certain habits. I do not just trust locks and deadbolts. I trust verifiable data. I opened my laptop and connected it to Martin's secure network again. When Diana started getting sick, I installed a very comprehensive security system. I needed to monitor the house in case she fell or needed medical assistance while I was in another room. Derek knew about the cameras. He actually complained about them, constantly claiming they were an invasion of privacy whenever he came over. What Derek did not know is how those cameras actually operated. He possesses the technological understanding of a teenager. He thinks that if you unplug a device from the wall, it simply ceases to exist. He thinks pulling a power cord is the ultimate security measure. I logged into a highly encrypted offshore server. A grid of blank black squares appeared on my screen. Each square represented a different room in my house. The live feed was dead. Derek had indeed gone through the house and unplugged every single camera he could find before he brought the movers in. But he did not realize that the physical cameras were merely optical relays. The actual recording system was hardwired into an independent battery backup hidden inside the walls. Every single second of video and audio was instantly uploaded to a secure cloud server. The data was untouchable. I bypassed the dead live feed and accessed the archived storage. I needed to see exactly what happened in my house before the movers arrived. I selected the master timeline and began scrolling backward. Yesterday was a flurry of activity with Derek, storming through the rooms holding his forged paperwork. I kept scrolling. 2 days ago, the house was mostly empty. Then I hit the timestamp for Tuesday evening. Exactly 3 days ago. A thumbnail image flickered to life in the center of the grid. The camera was located in the main living room, pointing directly at my antique cabinet. I clicked the thumbnail to expand the video to full screen. The image was crystal clear, high definition. It was 10 at night, EP. The front door opened and 2 figures walked into my living room. I turned the volume up on my laptop speakers. The audio was perfectly synchronized. It was Brooke and Chad. They were not wearing the formal clothing I had seen at the rehearsal dinner. They were dressed in casual athletic wear, looking entirely too comfortable in a home they did not own. Brooke tossed her expensive purse onto my sofa and let out a dramatic sigh. "It is finally going to happen now," she said, spinning around in the exact middle of the room. Chad walked straight past her and headed directly for my liquor cabinet. He did not even hesitate. He opened the glass doors with absolute confidence, as if he had been there 100 times before. He reached past the cheap bottles and grabbed a rare single malt scotch that Diana had bought for my 60th birthday, a bottle I had been saving for a truly special occasion. He popped the cork and poured 2 massive glasses without bothering to look for ice. Chad handed a full glass to Brooke. They clinked the heavy crystal tumblers together. "To the easiest payday of my entire life," Chad said. A smug grin plastered across his face. Brooke took a sip and laughed. A sharp, ugly sound that echoed through my empty house. "I cannot believe Derek actually bought the whole story," she said, shaking her head. "He was so terrified of looking broke in front of my friends that he practically begged you to take the house off his hands. He thinks he is a financial genius." Chad took a long drink of my scotch. "Derek is an absolute moron," Chad replied, walking over to my leather armchair and dropping his heavy frame into it. He propped his feet up on the mahogany coffee table, leaving dirty scuff marks on the polished wood. "He literally handed me the deed to $1 million property for half the price, and he thinks I am doing him a massive favor. Once the wedding is over and the ink is dry on that wire transfer, we are going to disappear, and Derek is going to be left standing at the altar with absolutely nothing but a massive charge. Brooke walked over and sat on the arm of the leather chair, wrapping her arm around Chad's neck. She kissed him deeply right there in the middle of my living room. "I am so glad I do not have to pretend to love that pathetic loser anymore," she whispered. "We take the $485,000 in cash from the insurance policy. We take the $600,000 from the house flip. We catch the first flight to Dubai, and we never look back. He can rot in federal prison for all I care." The old man drops dead. Martin stood behind me, watching the screen in absolute horrified silence. He had prosecuted hundreds of criminals, but the sheer callousness of what we were watching was entirely different. It was deeply personal. They were sitting in my house, drinking my scotch and casually planning the complete destruction of my family. I did not feel angry. I felt an incredible, terrifying calm. I paused the video, perfectly freezing the frame on their smiling faces. "The digital cloud does not lie, Martin," I said softly. I leaned back in the chair and closed the laptop. The evidence was absolutely flawless now. I pressed the spacebar on the keyboard, and the high-resolution video feed resumed playing immediately. On the screen, Brooke pulled away from Chad and walked over to my dining table. She ran her hand along the polished wood surface, leaving a faint smudge on the finish. She turned back to Chad with a wicked gleam in her eyes. "The best part of this entire plan is how completely insulated we are," she said. Her voice was crystal clear. "Derek is the one who took his father's medical records to that shady notary. Derek is the one who actually signed the forged power of attorney. He is the one who marched into the bank and authorized the wire transfer. My name is not on any paper. If the federal investigators ever catch on, they are going to look straight at the son who came into massive cash before the wedding. He is the perfect shield." Chad laughed, taking another gulp of my vintage scotch. He walked slowly over to the table to join her. "And my name is completely buried behind 3 layers of corporate anonymity," he added. "Apex Holdings will transfer the real estate deed to an overseas buyer by Monday morning. The $600, Susan, will be washed through offshore accounts before the old man even realizes his locks are changed. We take the $485,000 from the life insurance policy that Derek deposited into the joint account. We drain it all tomorrow night while he is dancing at the reception. We leave his phone in the hotel suite. Our flight to Dubai boards at Tulane in the morning. By the time Derek wakes up on Sunday, he will be completely broke, wifeless, and staring down the barrel of a federal indictment." Brooke smiled a smile so incredibly cold and completely devoid of human empathy. She raised her heavy crystal glass high in the air. "Ma to Derek," she mocked, "the most gullible groom in the history of the world." They clinked their glasses together again. I watched my future daughter-in-law and her personal trainer casually map out the absolute destruction of my only son. Derek had betrayed me, but he was doing it out of a desire to please a woman who viewed him as a temporary financial stepping stone. He thought he was stealing my legacy to build a life with her. He was digging his own grave and paying for the shovels. I felt a wave of pity for the boy. Not forgiveness, but pity. He was incredibly foolish, and he was about to pay a terrible price for his arrogance. I reached for the mouse and stopped the video playback. The 4,000-pixel resolution captured every micro-expression on their faces. The audio was pristine. A defense attorney could never argue that this was a deep fake. It was a direct, explicit confession of criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and planned evasion of justice. I opened an encrypted protocol. I highlighted the video file and the isolated audio track. With a few deliberate keystrokes, I began the download process. A green progress bar appeared on the screen, slowly inching toward completion. I mirrored the download simultaneously, sending a direct copy to Martin's secure legal server and another copy to an offline physical drive I kept in my briefcase. Martin stood perfectly still behind me. His breathing was incredibly heavy and deliberate. In all my years in the justice system, I have never seen a conspiracy laid out so plainly, he whispered. They are not just thieves. They are sociopaths. They are entirely willing to destroy a man's life just to fund a permanent vacation. Martin walked around the desk and slumped into his chair, rubbing his temples. We need to submit this video to the Cybercrimes Division immediately. This elevates the entire case. It is no longer just your son committing wire fraud. This is a multi-person criminal syndicate executing a coordinated strike against a vulnerable target. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will bring the hammer down on all of them. They will intercept Brooke and Chad at the airport before they ever set foot on that plane to Dubai. I watched the green download bar hit 100%. The files were locked and secured. I quietly closed the remote access window to my hidden home security system. "No, Martin," I said calmly. "We are not giving this video to the authorities just yet." Martin looked at me in shock. "Victor, you have the smoking gun right here. Why would you withhold this from the federal agents?" "Federal agents operate on a bureaucratic timeline," I explained. "They will open a case file. They will assign investigators. They will eventually issue formal subpoenas. By the time they actually move to arrest anyone, the wedding will be over. The damage to my family name will be public and permanent. I do not want them quietly arrested in an airport terminal in the middle of the night. I want them to face the absolute maximum consequence at the exact height of their arrogance." I packed my laptop back into its protective case and secured it inside my bag. I stood up and looked directly at Martin. Derek truly thought he could easily discard me. Brooke thought she could use my son to rob me blind. They both thought they were the smartest people in the room. But I built a career on exposing people who thought they were invincible. I am going to let them put on their expensive clothes. I am going to let them stand in front of their wealthy friends. I am going to let them believe that they have won, and then I am going to hire their entire world apart piece by piece. But before we do that, we need to answer one final question about Chad. Where exactly did a local fitness trainer get $600,000 in cash to buy my house? Martin slowly sank back into his heavy leather chair and pulled the keyboard toward him. "That is the exact detail that has been bothering me since I first looked at this file," he said, while typing a rapid series of commands. "Personal trainers do not typically have $500,000 of liquid capital sitting in a standard checking account ready to deploy on a moment's notice. Even a legitimate hard money lender would require a property appraisal and at least 48 hours to underwrite a loan of that size. Mad Chad had to get this cash from a source that completely bypasses the traditional banking sector, a source that does not ask questions and operates strictly in the shadows." I walked around the desk and stood behind his shoulder, watching the screen as the forensic software dug into the origin of the $600 Zuzan deposit into the Apex Holdings account. The money did not come from a traditional retail bank. It originated from a small private commercial lending firm located in a dilapidated industrial park just outside the city limits. Martin highlighted the name of the firm, Silver State Financial Services. "Do you know them?" I asked. Martin let out a low whistle that sounded incredibly strained.